You bump the edge of someone's chair with your bag. They haven't even turned around yet. You're already saying sorry, twice, maybe 3 times, the word out of your mouth before you've even checked whether anything happened at all. Nobody asked you to apologize. Nobody looked at you with an expression that meant anything. The sorry left your mouth before the moment had a chance to become anything at all. You do this so often you've stopped noticing you're doing it, and the strange part is you did it before there was anything to be sorry for. This wasn't a habit of politeness. It was a program running exactly as designed. Somewhere in you, a system built for tracking potential disruption fired before any disruption had actually occurred. Not a personality trait. Not a quirk you picked up from being the nice one. A calculation completed in a fraction of a second, aimed at closing a gap that, as far as anyone else was concerned, didn't even exist yet. It's tempting to call this a personality. People do, casually, all the time. "I'm just a very apologetic person," said the way you'd describe a favorite color, something chosen rather than something installed. But a trait doesn't fire on a schedule you can predict down to the half second. A trait doesn't specifically activate the instant your bag grazes furniture, or the instant your voice rises slightly above someone else's, or the instant silence lasts a beat too long after you've spoken. What fires that precisely isn't a trait. It's a response. Willpower has nothing to do with it, and neither does trying harder to relax. You can be aware of the pattern in complete detail, understand exactly what it is, and still hear the word leave your mouth half a second before you decided to say it. That gap between noticing and speaking is the whole story. The apology isn't a decision you're making. It's a decision that's already been made, somewhere below where decisions usually happen, and your voice is just the last stop it passes through on its way out. If anything, being self-aware makes this stranger, not easier. You can read every book on the subject, recognize the pattern the instant it fires, narrate it to yourself in real time, and still watch the sorry leave your mouth anyway. Insight operates at the speed of thought. This operates faster than that. Knowing what a reflex is has never once stopped a reflex from firing. Watch how often this shows up once you start looking for it. In a meeting, you raise your hand to ask a question, and the sentence starts with an apology for asking it at all. Sorry, quick question. As though a question itself were an imposition that needed softening before it landed. Nobody in the room considers questions an imposition. You do, reflexively, on their behalf before they've had the chance to decide for themselves. A colleague misplaces a file, and you find yourself apologizing for it, even though your name isn't anywhere near the mistake. Something in you would rather absorb blame that was never assigned than sit inside the discomfort of watching someone else carry it. In a relationship, you mention a preference, where to eat, what time to leave, what you'd rather do this weekend, and the sentence arrives wrapped in an apology before it's even finished. Sorry, I just feel like maybe we could, as though wanting something were the transgression. Not the wanting itself, but the audacity of naming it out loud. Further along, it starts showing up in moments that have nothing to do with etiquette at all. You cancel plans because you're sick, and you apologize 4 separate times across 2 messages, as though illness were a personal failing you owed someone an explanation for. You take up space in a conversation for slightly longer than usual, and the first thing out of your mouth once you stop talking is an apology for talking. At the far end of this, it shows up in decisions that shape years, not moments. Staying quieter in a job than the role actually calls for, agreeing to plans that quietly cost you, softening opinions before anyone has even disagreed with them, because somewhere the calculation runs that being fully present is itself a kind of imposition that needs to be pre-forgiven. None of this is about the chair, or the file, or the dinner reservation. Each one is a stand-in for something else, a small test the pattern runs constantly, checking whether it's still safe to exist at full volume. Notice what it feels like in the body because the feeling is the same across every example, even when the situations look nothing alike. A small tightening just under the ribs arriving before the sentence does. Shoulders drawing in half an inch. A held breath that gets released only once the apology has actually left your mouth, as though the sorry itself were the thing letting the air back in. The body isn't reacting to the chair or the meeting or the dinner plan. It's reacting to something that happened somewhere else, a long time ago, and simply borrowing this moment to run the same old sequence again. Here's where the science gets genuinely interesting, because researchers studying this haven't landed on one clean explanation. They've landed on several overlapping ones, each covering a different piece of the same behavior. Sociologist Irving Goffman, in 1959, described social life as a kind of ongoing performance, where people constantly manage the impression they're making on others, what he called face work, the effort spent protecting both your own social standing and the other person's, often before either of you has said a word. A preemptive apology fits this almost too well. It's face work running on a hair trigger, smoothing a wrinkle that hasn't appeared yet, just in case it does. But Goffman's framework describes the behavior. It doesn't explain why some people's version of it fires this early, this often, this automatically. For that, the research moves earlier, into childhood and into what a person learned, long before language, about how safe it was to simply exist without managing anyone's reaction to them. Psychologist Mary Ainsworth's attachment research, published in 1978, mapped how infants calibrate their behavior around the reliability of a caregiver's responses. A child who learns that a caregiver's mood is unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, with no clear signal for which one is coming, doesn't relax into that uncertainty. They start monitoring for it. They learn to read microsignals early and often, and they learn that smoothing things over before a mood shift fully arrives is safer than waiting to find out what happens if they don't. This isn't a story about anyone doing anything wrong. Most environments that build this pattern aren't dramatic. A parent under financial stress. A household where tension arrived unpredictably rather than constantly. A sibling dynamic where staying agreeable kept the peace. None of it needs to be extreme to teach a developing nervous system that watching closely and adjusting early is the safer strategy. The lesson gets encoded quietly, the way most lessons that shape adult behavior are, not through a single dramatic event, but through hundreds of small, ordinary ones, repeated until the response stopped feeling like a response at all and started feeling like who you are. What made the lesson so durable is that it worked. A child who apologizes early, who smooths a mood before it fully turns, genuinely does reduce friction in an unpredictable household, at least in the moment. The strategy gets reinforced not because it was the right read of the situation, but because it was rewarded often enough to feel correct. And a strategy that once kept a household calmer has no built-in mechanism for retiring itself once the household is gone. It simply keeps generalizing outward, to chairs, to meetings, to relationships that were never unpredictable in the first place. Psychologist Mark Leary's sociometer theory, first proposed in 1995, adds another layer. Leary's research suggested that self-esteem itself functions less like a fixed trait and more like a gauge, a running measurement of how included or excluded a person is likely to be within their social group at any given moment. If that gauge got calibrated early to read every ambiguous signal as a potential drop in standing, then apologizing preemptively isn't really about the chair or the meeting or the dinner plan. It's a maintenance behavior for the gauge itself, a way of keeping the needle from moving in a direction that once meant something was genuinely at risk. None of this means the pattern can be reasoned away, because it was never installed through reasoning in the first place. But it can be tested, one interaction at a time, against evidence it was never actually given the chance to collect. Here's the experiment. The next time you feel the apology rising before anyone has reacted to anything, the bag against the chair, the question in the meeting, the preference you're about to name, pause for 3 seconds before you speak. Not longer. 3 seconds is enough to interrupt the automatic sequence without turning the moment into something visibly strange. In those 3 seconds, look for one specific thing, actual evidence, a raised eyebrow, a change in tone, anything real happening in front of you rather than anything you're predicting might happen. If you find it, respond to it however you normally would. But if the 3 seconds pass and there's nothing there, no reaction, no shift, no evidence at all, let the moment go without the apology. Not because you're forcing yourself to be different, but because the data simply didn't support the response this time. Picture it concretely. Your bag catches the corner of a chair in a coffee shop. The old sequence would have the apology out before your hand has even steadied the strap. Instead, you count. 1. The person hasn't turned their head. 2. No sound, no shift in their shoulders, nothing. 3. Still nothing. You keep walking. Nothing happened, and more importantly, nothing needed to happen. No one was disrupted. No relationship needed repairing. No imposition was ever committed in the first place. That's the whole result. Not a dramatic revelation. Just 3 seconds of silence where an apology used to automatically go, and evidence for possibly the first time of what actually would have occurred if you'd said nothing at all. Do this 10 times this week. Keep a rough tally, even just a mental one, of how many times the evidence actually showed up versus how many times it didn't. The point isn't to stop apologizing altogether. Plenty of apologies are appropriate, necessary, kind. The point is to start collecting information the pattern was built without, proof gathered in real time, about how often the disruption it's guarding against actually happens. Most people who try this are surprised by the ratio. Psychologists David Clark and Adrian Wells described something adjacent to this in 1995 in their research on what they called safety behaviors, small precautionary actions people take to prevent a feared outcome, which paradoxically end up preventing the person from ever discovering the feared outcome usually wasn't coming in the first place. The behavior protects against a threat that more often than not was never going to materialize. And because the behavior always arrives before the outcome can be tested, the belief underneath it never gets updated. It just keeps running decade after decade on the same handful of old data points. This is the part that makes the pattern so stubborn. A safety behavior doesn't just fail to solve the problem it's built for. It actively prevents the problem from ever being disproven because the apology arrives before the moment can play out on its own. Every preemptive sorry is, in a small way, evidence the pattern never lets itself collect against its own premise. The 3-second pause isn't a trick or a life hack. It's simply the first time the behavior gets removed long enough for the underlying belief to be tested at all. This is the part where a video like this usually promises you an answer. So it's worth being honest about what still isn't known. Researchers can describe the mechanism reasonably well at this point. The hypervigilance, the impression management, the early calibration, the safety behavior loop that keeps the whole thing running without ever being tested. What's much less settled is why this particular strategy, the apology specifically, rather than humor or invisibility or over-explaining or a dozen other appeasement strategies people develop instead, becomes the one a given nervous system reaches for. Two people can grow up in similarly unpredictable households and come out with completely different default responses. Nobody has fully mapped why the apology gets selected for some people and not others, or what specific combination of temperament and early experience tips the scale toward this exact behavior rather than its many close relatives. That's not a gap in this explanation. It's a gap in the field. Science is still working out what to call the exact mechanism that picks one appeasement strategy over another. And anyone claiming to have it fully solved is telling you more than the research currently supports. It's worth sitting with that honestly for a moment, rather than rushing past it toward something tidier. There is no confirmed answer here, not because the research is lazy, but because a nervous system's specific choice of strategy sits at the intersection of temperament, timing, and 100 small environmental variables that are almost impossible to isolate after the fact, decades later, in an adult who no longer remembers most of the moments that built it. Maybe it's genuinely random which strategy takes hold. Maybe it isn't, and the field simply hasn't found the variable yet. Both are honest possibilities, and neither one changes what's already true about the pattern itself, or what a person can do about it starting today. What is clear is this: the next time your bag brushes a chair and the word is already halfway out of your mouth before anyone has even turned around, that's not you being polite, and it's not a flaw in your character. It's a calculation, encoded somewhere a long time before you had any say in it, still running its math before the data has even had the chance to arrive.